All right, Tucker, next time we'll put a tip jar out for you. So that, our scripture passage today comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 11. It's just two verses, 25 and 26. Jesus said to her, and that would be Martha, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" Today is Easter Sunday. It is also the seventh and final Sunday of our sermon series where we're looking at a Christian reflection on Gandhi's 7 social sins. And the social sin for today is worship without sacrifice. Worship without sacrifice, according to Gandhi, is one of those 7 sins that leads to so much cruelty and violence and hate in the world. Worship without sacrifice. Now, we could substitute other words to tease out different possible meanings. Instead of saying worship without sacrifice, we could say belief without practice, peace without justice, happiness without empathy, love of God without love for neighbor, Easter without crucifixion, life without death. And of course, the way to remedy the social sin is to put them all together so that we have worship with sacrifice, so that we can have belief with practice, peace with justice, happiness with empathy, love of God with love of neighbor, Easter with crucifixion, life with death. And that's not the common way that we think about those things. So I was thinking about life with death. I was reminded of the phrase, perhaps you've heard of it. It says, whistling past the graveyard. You ever heard that? Whistling past the graveyard is a phrase that expresses a sense of false bravado, pretending that we're more courageous than we really are whenever we are confronted with mortality, with death. And so literally sometimes it happens for people to whistle as they walk past the graveyard, anything to kind of distract and make yourself feel better and not turn and confront the inevitability of death. There are lots of different ways of whistling past the graveyard. One of the ways that I come into contact with quite often is laughing past the graveyard. Humor. Everybody loves a good funeral funny story. They're just wonderful. I've told you before about the retired pastor in Alabama, Pastor Waddell, came out of retirement to do a funeral for a family. Did the service in the church, went out and got into the funeral procession. In the South, it's common to have the funeral in the church and the burial 30 minutes away at where the family plot is in the cemetery. I have never been a part of a funeral procession here in Medford, but I was always in them in Alabama. And Pastor Waddell came back to do the service, went out and got in the car in the funeral procession. In Alabama, usually it is a patrolman who leads the way. After that, you have the hearse, where you have the deceased. And then in the third car, the pastor is in that car, frequently driving members of the grieving family. And then, of course, there could be 30 cars behind from everybody who attended, and they're all going towards the graveyard to commit the body. And I don't know what happened. I don't know what was going on in Pastor Waddell's mind, but apparently he thought they were moving too slow, because you only go about 30 miles an hour when you're in a funeral procession. And kind of forgetting where he was and what he was doing, when a passing lane presented itself, he just zoomed right past the hearse. And I'd like to think about that family in the car with the pastor, watching their loved one whiz by. And I've often wondered, because I never heard the rest of the story, I wonder, how did he overcome that? Did he put his blinker on and merge back in? I don't know, but it's a funny story, and it's one we like to laugh at because, in a way, it helps us kind of laugh at death, whistle past the graveyard, feel like we have the upper hand after all, but we know it's there for all of us. There are a lot of ways of whistling past the graveyard. False bravado, acting defiant. When I was a kid, I was in several different funeral processions over the course of my childhood. I remember my brother and I in the back seat. Being in a funeral procession, I do not recall whose it was, but we were probably 20th car back in line, and we're going through, and my brother and I, we just think it is extremely cool that we're getting to run all the red lights, because you get to do that in a funeral procession. And so we're seeing red light, red light, red light, and we turn and we look at each other, and we instantly communicate without words what's going on here, and we become the Duke boys from the Dukes of Hazzard. And the next time we go under a light, we both look at each other and go, "Yee-haw!" That's whistling past the graveyard, pretending that we've got it under control when we know that death is right there. I will suggest to you that in churches across this nation today, there are lots of Christians gathered in services like this one who are engaging in whistling past the graveyard. The Easter message that is being proclaimed is one that says, well, we don't have to worry about death. Jesus gave us a dodge around it. So let's just all act like everything's great and rosy and wonderful. That is not what Easter is. Easter does not solve the problem of death. Easter is where we get to when we can start to resolve some of our own fears about death. Easter was never meant to be an example of whistling past the graveyard. Easter is actually turning and walking straight into the middle of that graveyard and hugging and embracing death, which is very different than whistling. There are three lines that I always find quite moving. They can be found in the book of worship that the United Methodist Church does. There are three lines that appear in our services. We don't call them funerals in the Methodist Church. We call them services of death and resurrection, both side by side, death and resurrection. And the lines are prayer, and they go like this. Help us to live as those who are prepared to die. Help us to live as those who are prepared to die. And then the second line, enable us to die as those who go forth to live. Enable us to die as those who go forth to live. And the third one, so that living or dying, our life may be in you. So that living or dying, our life may be in you. I would like to suggest to you that those three lines do not say three different things, that all three of those lines say the exact same thing. Let us live our lives in such a way it is as though we have already died and we are completely free of the fear and the entanglements that this life puts on us. It's called resurrected living, and it is available to us now. The Christian faith, and this may come as a shock, but the Christian faith is not primarily about beliefs. Now, I know that for 2,000 years, the church has been hammering that home. believe, believe, believe. But it's not primarily about beliefs. The Christian faith is more about dwelling in the story of Jesus and having the story of Jesus dwell in you. It's inhabiting the story of God as expressed through Jesus and having that story inside of you. And that has very little to do with beliefs. It has everything to do with a kind of living, a way of living, which is what the earliest Christians were called. They were called people of the way. They were not called people of the belief. And as long as we focus on beliefs, we are really focusing on our own insecurities and fears and needs. It's not so much about belief. It's more about habitation, living in the story. Here's an example. How many of you remember, it happens in the Gospel of John chapter 8. It's the woman who was caught in adultery. And the religious leaders, now these are the people who believe the right things, the religious leaders catch this woman in adultery and they bring her to Jesus and they say to Jesus, "What shall we do with her?" The law states that she should be stoned. Now, they're asking Jesus a question of belief. They're wanting to test him. Do you believe the right thing, Jesus? Do you believe in the law? Do you believe that sinners like this should be punished by stoning? What do you believe? And you may remember that Jesus completely dodges the belief question. He kind of doodles in the dirt. And then he says, "Let those among you who have no sin throw the first stone." And gradually all the men, the religious leaders, the right believers drop their stones and walk away. And Jesus says to the woman, "Where are those who condemned you?" And she says, "They have gone." And he says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." You remember that story? Pretty well-known story. Now I want to tell you another story. This one is about Judge Garner and Carol Ann. Judge Garner is a real judge. Carol Ann is a real prostitute. Carol Ann was arrested on the charge of prostitution, and her case file was brought before Judge Garner so that he could set the bail amount for Carol Ann. Now, the typical bail amount at this time, in this time and place when this occurred, was $50. And the judge had issued that bail amount time and time again. It was just kind of what you did. It was the amount for prostitution bail, $50. Except in this particular case, Judge Garner was participating in a study, a research project, where he had been asked to reflect on two questions before making judgments or issuing decisions. And so he put aside the file on Carol Ann, and he opened his file on this research study he was participating in, and there were two questions, and the first question was, how do you feel when you think about your own death? And the second question was, what do you believe happens to you after you die? And so the judge, as he was supposed to, wrote down his responses to those questions. How do you feel when you think about your death? He wrote, "It makes me feel sad because I think of those who love me and how they will miss me when I'm gone." I can empathize with that. We can all empathize with that. We might have written something very much like that. And then the next one was, and what do you believe happens to you after you die? And he wrote, "I believe in Jesus. And even though I know my body will decay, I believe that my spirit will be lifted up and I will be united with Jesus, my Savior." So, he thought two things. He thought first about his own mortality, and then he thought about his religious belief. And he closed the file, and he brought Carol Ann's case right back in front of him, and he set her bail at $455. The typical bail amount was $50. The bail amount he himself had set in many other cases had been $50. But suddenly, he made the charge much worse. $455. Now let's think about this in comparison to what Jesus did. He has this prostitute brought before him. Standard punishment, $50. Jesus has this woman caught in adultery. Standard punishment, stoning to death. The judge, after sharing his fears and his religious beliefs, imposes a harsher penalty than usual. Jesus imposes no penalty at all and forgives her and sends her on her way. What the study found, and this has been duplicated time and time again with a lot of different kinds of people in a lot of different situations, is that human beings, when they are reminded of their mortality, and when they are reminded of their belief system about their mortality, instantly become more punishing towards people they disagree with and more defensive about the beliefs they hold. And that is shown in time and again and again and again. So think about our culture, where our culture, especially politically, tries to keep us constantly in a state of fear of our mortality and defensiveness about our beliefs. Now, what kind of culture do we become when we're in that? So here is a great story where the judge believed. He believed in Jesus. He believed that that really happened, that there was this woman caught in adultery, and that Jesus said, let those with the first stone, let them without sin throw the stone, and Jesus forgave her and let her go. He believed all that, but he didn't act on it. He believed it, but the story didn't dwell within him, and he didn't dwell within the story. And so the gospel passed him by. Jesus does ask Martha. This is Jesus, the passage that I read is Jesus going to the funeral for Lazarus. Lazarus is dead. He's talking to Martha. And if you recall, Jesus asked her, do you believe in me? Do you believe in resurrection? So if Jesus says that it's about belief, shouldn't that be the final word? It's about belief? And yet that's not what belief means in John. The Greek word is pistio, and its translation into English has been belief, which is terrible and has done great harm and damage to the faith. Because when Jesus says, do you believe, he is not asking, do you believe in me as a certain kind of fact? Do you believe in me as if I exist? Do you believe in me like you believe in gravity? That's not what he's asking. When he uses the word pistio, he's saying, do you trust in me, trust enough in the story to take it into yourself and to live it? And when Jesus asks us to trust in him, it's not like he's asking us to trust in a person. This is not like trusting in your candidate. When we are asked to trust in Jesus, we are being asked to trust in God. And that is a much bigger story. That is a sacred story that we as Christians experience from God through Jesus, and it's living in that story and having that story live inside of us. And it is so much more than belief. So I tried to think, okay, John, put your money where your mouth is. How would you express it? How would you express your faith using belief words, but also living words? And so I gave it a go, and here's what I came up with. This is my attempt to let the story of God expressed in Jesus live in me so that I can live in it. I am going to live a life to the best of my ability, where my beliefs help me engage with other beliefs in a respectful and relational way. And I am not going to live a kind of life where my religious beliefs means that everybody else's is wrong. And I'm going to embrace that life because of the story of Jesus. I am going to live a life where my beliefs promote greater compassion and understanding. And I am not going to live a life where my need to believe in certain facts makes me more judgmental and uncaring towards the vulnerable in our society. And I do that because the stories of Jesus are living in me. I'm going to live a life where my beliefs are open and flexible enough to participate in and celebrate the discoveries and achievements of humankind, and I am not going to live the kind of life where my beliefs require me to deny the benefits of human achievement and advancement. I'm going to live a life where my beliefs actively promote fairness and equality, even if it means that people like me have to give up privilege so that others can have more. And I'm not going to live a life where my beliefs shield me from uncomfortable truths about my species, my nation, my race, my gender, my sexual identity, my family, or myself. I'm not going to. I'm going to live a life that aspires to real peace and resurrection even in the face of death, and I am not going to live a life that denies and fears death. In other words, I'm going to try to live a life that embraces both worship and sacrifice, because that is what we're asked in the gospel. I came across a story this week about Miriam. Miriam was an expecting mother. She had been a part of a prenatal support group of other expecting mothers. And they had met for several months and talked about what they were going through and talked about their excitement and their anxiety about having a baby. And the plan was that they were all kind of due around the same time. And the plan was that after 3 months or so, after the babies were all born, they would get together for a reunion, a celebration. Miriam had a son named Aaron, who only lived 66 days, never left the hospital. And about the time he died was the time that she got the invitation to attend the celebration reunion with all the other mothers who had been in her group to meet together and to show off each other's babies and to celebrate. And she cried when she read the invitation. And she had a lot of mixed feelings about going to this celebration. She dreaded calling up and explaining what had happened and having to go through all that stuff with somebody. She didn't want to do that. She was just really, really conflicted about what she should do. On the one hand, she thought, there's no reason for me to go. I don't have a baby to show off. Why should I go? But another part of her really wanted to attend. She wanted to go. She wanted to bring pictures. And she wanted to share this experience and let everybody know that her baby was real. And she felt like if she didn't go, it was kind of erasing the fact that her child had ever lived at all. She knew that if she didn't go, she'd be isolated, fall into depression and despair. But she also didn't want to ruin the occasion for the other mothers. They're there with their babies, being happy and celebrating, and she's going to bring the news of her dead child, bring death into this. Finally, she called up the woman who was organizing it, told her what was going on, and the woman said, "Please come." And she went. And she showed the pictures of Aaron, and she looked on at the other babies with what she describes as a poignant ache. a poignant ache. But happy for them and happy for the mothers, and participated in their celebration as best she could. And then she came home. And when she came home, she felt just a little sense of triumph. She had overcome isolation and had established connection with people in real relationship, and in some sense, some small sense of Easter had happened there. I thought about that story because I thought about today, and today is Easter, and I got to tell you, Easter's a tough one, because I think to myself, everybody just wants to be up and happy, and it should be all worship and no sacrifice. It's Easter, all worship and no sacrifice. Let's just do the worship thing. And then I think, but that's not the story that dwells within and that we have been called to live into. So I just can't do it. Even though part of me really wants to do it, I just can't do it. Worship and sacrifice have to be held together. So I would simply say that Easter is not a fact to believe in, nor is it something to have doubts about. If you have beliefs or doubts, then I suggest you get into a new paradigm. It's not about believing and it's not about doubting. It is about living. Having the story dwell within you so that you can dwell within the story, and Christ is alive in how you live. That's what I'm thinking about this Easter. When I imagine Jesus saying to me what he said to Martha, looking in my face, touching my shoulder, "Do you believe, John?" I hear him saying, "Are you ready to live inside this story with me? And let me live it with you." I'd like for us to close by saying those 3 lines from that prayer together so that we can try to live this way ourselves. Help us to live as those who are prepared to die. Let's do that again. Help us to live as those who are prepared to die. That's a strong statement. Enable us to die as those who go forth to live. Enable us to die as those who go forth to live. So that living or dying, our life may be in you. So that living or dying, our life may be in you. That is Easter. That is the peace that comes from having both worship and sacrifice, resurrection and crucifixion